It's all gone now, or gone to pieces, but this was what we used to call the labor movement. Sometimes in elevated May Day rhetoric, it was Tig Moo, this great movement of ours. And sometimes it was TMAAW, the movement as a whole. But even as we mocked this stock speech, we felt a fierce pride at belonging to the ranks that it described. Men and women, warriors for the working day, who had survived mass unemployment and slum housing and bitter exploitation, stuck together to resist fascism at home and abroad, rebuilt the country after 1945, fought for independence for the colonies, and striven to remove the terrible fear of illness and penury and a Dickensian old age that had hag-ridden the British working class. In 1939, when it had once again become necessary to summon those workers back to the colors and the flag of the defense of the nation, mainly in consequence of the abysmal and shameful capitulations of the ruling class in the face of Nazism, the recruiting officers had been appalled at the human material that was presented to them. Men with crumbled teeth, failing eyesight, wheezing pigeon-like chests, bow-legged and balding, exhibiting symptoms of deficiency diseases like rickets and pellagra that would have shocked some of Britain's Indian and African subjects. As a child born after the war, and in the first years of the National Health Service, itself always semi-reverently capitalized by the people as the NHS, I was a beneficiary of all this, despite my father's Toryism. Free blackcurrant juice for vitamin C, making me pee purple, was available at school, as was free milk, from which I first made the nauseating discovery of what is now called lactose intolerance. A district nurse called, as a matter of course, on any household that had registered the birth of a new baby. If I developed a squint or a toothache, my parents need not fear bankruptcy, but could take me to be fitted with spectacles or healed with a filling. The resulting work is not beautiful. I winced with recognition when I first read the expression British teeth in Gore Vidal's Judgment of Paris, but it is nonetheless real and tangible and available as a kind of right, and a hard-won right at that. Everybody in the hall is proud of the fact that the most elemental thing of all, human blood, is freely donated to the National Health Service, which never runs out of it and never pays a penny to those who line up to give it, and expecting nothing in return but a strong brown cup of serious proletarian tea. For me, this movement is everything. It contains within itself the germinal hope of a better future where a thinking working class can acquire the faculties of a serious party of government and can extend these small early reformist gains into something more comprehensive, all the while uniting with similar movements in other countries to repudiate the narrow nationalism and chauvinism that led to wars and partitions. To be enrolled in its ranks is to be part of an alternative history as well as an alternative present and future. Official Britain may have its Valhalla of heroes and statesmen and conquerors and empire builders, but we know that the highest point ever reached by European civilization was in the city of Basel in 1912, when the leaders of the socialist parties of all countries met to coordinate an opposition to the coming World War. The names of real heroes like Jean Jaurès and Karl Liebknecht make the figures of Asquith and Churchill and Lord George seem like pygmies. The violence and disruption of a socialist transformation in those years would have been infinitely less than the insane sacrifice of culture to barbarism, and the Nazism and Stalinism that ensued from it. This feeling seemed absolutely authentic to me at the time. As a matter of fact, it still does. The only two immediate difficulties with the idealism are that first, the same movement is, at least for the time being, expressed politically by a very boring and compromised party known as the Labour Party, and second, that in the industry where I actually happen to work, the unions are the most hidebound and conservative force of all, which in the newspaper business is saying quite a good deal. In my efforts to live up to Peter de Vries' maxim, I took various mainstream jobs, from being a freelance researcher for the Insight team at Harvold Evans' Sunday Times, then at its zenith, to working at the newly formed London Weekend Television, to being a correspondent for the Daily Express and a part-time editorial or leader writer for Old Evening Standard. This makes me one of the last of those who can say they worked for Beaverbrook newspapers. The famous old racket, half magic and half criminal, that was preserved forever in Evelyn Waugh's portrayal of the Daily Beast. Writing my own introduction to the Penguin edition of Scoop, I said of Waugh's Fleet Service masterpiece that it perfectly evoked both the fugitive glamour of the business, that pseudo-deco black glass palace on Fleet Street from which one might take a taxi at short notice to the airport, clutching a brick of traveler's checks with an exotic visa and one's old blue-gold hardback British passport, the Street of Adventure, as well as its irredeemable squalor, the Street of Shame. Here is how Waugh introduces a group of veteran British hacks met in some dismal overseas bar. Shumble, Welper, and Pig knew Corker. They had loitered of old on many a doorstep, and forced an entry into many a stricken home. I once had a drink with an express veteran, his face richly veined and seamed with grog blossom, in the old Punch Tavern opposite of the offices, while he explained to me the etiquette of stricken home violation. The bereaved generally like to offer a cup of tea, he said, out of immemorial working-class courtesy. Thus, when extracting the maximum of tragedy from the relatives of a recent victim, be it of crime, of fire, or plane crash, it was always important to take along a colleague. He offers to help them out in the kitchen while they put the kettle on, and that gives you a nice time to slip into the front room and collar the family photos from off the mantelpiece. Lest I seem to pretend to have been shocked by this, I freely admit that the unofficial motto for our foreign correspondence desk was, when setting off to some scene of mass graves and riven societies, "Anyone here been raped and speaks English?" In Martin Amis' novel of Fleet Street, Yellow Dog, you might think that the contempt shown by the reporters for both their subjects and the readers is overdone, but you would be wrong. In many ways, journalism was the ideal profession for someone like myself, who was drawn to the Janus-faced mode of life. Did I say profession? There is something about the craft and practice, better words for it, that is naturally two-faced. One has to pretend to be at least formally polite to the politicians one interviews. One has to be civil and smiling and curious when sitting with a criminal lunatic, freedom fighters, and crazed aphasic dictators. I can give an example of this from the formative days of my own career in the media racket. In the early 1970s, in what had once been called the Jewel of Africa, there was a state-sponsored pogrom against Ugandans of Asian descent, who were first dispossessed and then deported. The man responsible was the almost pornographically wicked figure Idi Amin, later to become an exiled guest in Saudi Arabia as a heroic son of Islam. His bigotry and greed were two aspects of the same rampant disorder. He wanted the assets of the Asian business community as his political spoil. He also wanted to be a man who Africanized his unhappy country by ethnic cleansing. Most of the Asians had British passports, though it had never been thought that they would employ them for the crassly tactless purpose of, say, coming to live in the United Kingdom. When they did exercise this small legal privilege, there was quite a strong racist reaction to their arrival. One of those who was most demagogic on the point was Sir Oswald Mosley, an aging figure to whom there still clung the authentic stench of the 1930s. When he had been the black-shirted leader of the British Union of Fascists since the end of the Second World War, he had chosen to live in Paris. As it happened, my very amateur network of intelligence and information brought me the news that the old would-be dictator was in London and staying at the Ritz. I decided to see if he would come on the television show, for which I was then a researcher and cub reporter. The first part was easy. I established that he was indeed at the Ritz and that he was willing to be interviewed. The second bit was slightly more difficult. Was I not having to be civil to a man who had Joseph Goebbels as the best man at his wedding to Lady Diana Mitford, with Adolf Hitler, who gave the happy couple a framed portrait of himself as a nuptial gift? In attendance as guest of honor, I decided that the problem could be resolved in the following way. The opportunity was too good to miss, but the formalities ended. I would send him a car and would greet him in the lobby, but would not extend my hand when he arrived. I rehearsed the moment many times, waking and sleeping, until the limousine drew up and the now silvered and bull-like figure of the old bastard began to emerge. Somehow I found I was putting out my own hand first and saying, "Sir Oswald, how very good of you to come." In what seemed a volitionless state, I then conducted him to the hospitality suite and poured him a drink. I can justify this if you like. It occurs to me now that I could have also justified it then, since Mosley was the model for Sir Roderick Spode, the brutish and ridiculous leader of the Black Shorts movement, and P.G. Wodehouse's 1938 masterpiece, The Code of the Woosters. And one doesn't get many chances to meet such an original. But I was far too solemn for that in those days. Instead, I justified myself tactically. From our ensuing chat, I learned that he had never dreaded the Marxist hecklers of the 30s who had hurled rocks and vegetation at him. The most disconcerting tactic of the left, he informed me, had been to occupy the first few rows of the seats in a town hall, and then, as he began speaking, to open newspapers and bury their faces in the pages. It's somehow very hard to whip up a crowd when the front row seats are thus otherwise engaged. He carried on in this urban and confessional matter until it was time to put him on the set and begin the serious business. As soon as the studio lights came up and the camera's light began winking red, he seemed to shrug off his previous character and style, and to become suddenly lean and hawk-like as of yore. The whole timbre of his voice altered. To the interviewer's first question of the Ugandan Asian immigration, he returned a rasping, sneering answer that summoned all the old echoes of race and nation. Thus green and untried as I was, I had the opportunity to notice in 1 hour what many members of the British upper class had been unable to bring themselves to see in the 1930s. There was one Mosley who acted in a fairly civilized and even amusing way in the drawing rooms and country houses, and another whose relish it was to go down to the slums of the East End and get all dirtied up with those who were so base and stupid as to think that their lives would improve if they were not afflicted with Jewish neighbors. How I managed the conclusion of the thing I can't now recall. Perhaps I was proud and heroic enough to decline a handshake as Sir Oswald departed. Anyway, it taught me that the moral attitudes that one strikes are often devoid of significance. This was all in the 70s. When exactly did we begin to periodize the decades instead of saying by reigns? Did people in the 30s know that they were going to be historically collectivized in that way? There were no noughts or tens in the 20th century, which went straight from Edwardian to the Great War. Hints of an idea of the 20s had to be contained in the concept of the Jazz Age. In the spring of 1968, I do remember a revolutionary speaker on the pavement outside the London School of Economics, referring to a year that might one day be matched with 1848 and 1917. And we did have a sort of conscience of living in the 60s, while they were still going on. But the 70s were only the 70s because they had to have a name. Nullity and anticlimax appeared too close to close in on all sides. And so did certain kinds of nastiness, often composed of or distilled from the worst of the 60s. The television HQ to which I had invited Mosley was situated in a new high-rise on the south bank of the Thames, with a commanding view of London. Looking out of one of its higher windows after lunch one day, I first saw and then heard a huge explosion. It seemed to be located somewhere near St. Paul's Cathedral. What I had just seen and was to be seeing at street level within the hour was the first Irish Republican Army car bomb to detonate on the British mainland. The target had been the Old Bailey, the country's Supreme Court. I had always been opposed to the partition of Ireland, and a strong supporter of the civil rights movement against the Orange sectarian ministrate that embodied the petrified, stagnant outcomes of that old and cruel division. My outfit, the International Socialists, had been involved at an early stage in the non-sectarian protests and marches and strikes that had challenged the Ulster six-county rump system. Many was the evening, especially after the Bloody Sunday massacre by British troops in Derry, and after Britain's imposition of the internment, better known as imprisonment, without the trial, but with some torture, that I had spent in Irish pubs and clubs making speeches and organizing protests. As a journalist also, I started visiting Belfast and Derry and Newry, and had my first experience of seeing shots fired in anger, as well as nail bombs thrown and gasoline bombs too. As one brought up inside the protective womb of the Royal Navy and its bases, it felt very strange to me to see the British Army patrolling streets that were at least constitutionally British, but while wearing the visors and helmets of occupying space aliens. That was one distinct oddity. The other, in a city like Belfast, where there had been almost no Commonwealth immigration, was that if one saw a black face, it was almost invariably the face of a British soldier. Some of the taunts from angry old ladies in Republican slum districts did not fail to make the use of this striking contrast. "What do you do with it then, soldier boy?" shrilled one banshee as a young squatty from Barbados flourished a rubber bullet, a crowd-control device that resembled a Coke bottle sculpted in black. "Post it to your frockin' wife." I never forgot the look of hurt on his face. With James Fenton, whom I had eventually succeeded in recruiting to the International Socialist, I made a few ships to Northern Ireland and collaborated on an article or two for the New Statesman. One of these carried our joint byline, something that still gives me great pride in retrospect. Our own polemics were of course staunchly non-sectarian, stressing the contribution of Irish Protestants like Wolfe Tone to the long tradition of republicanism, and laying emphasis on historic Irish socialists like James Connolly and Jim Larkin. In the squalid and cramped back streets around the Belfast shipyards, it seemed to us no better illustration could be found of the need for working people to forget their confessional and national differences and unite in a brotherly fashion. But to say that such appeals failed to achieve locomotive force among the masses would be to understate the case to an almost heroic degree. I eventually came to appreciate a feature of the situation that has since helped me to understand similar obduracy in Lebanon, Gaza, Cyprus, and several other spots. The local leaderships that are generated by the troubles in such places do not want there to be a solution. A solution would mean that they no longer deferred to by visiting UN or American mediators, no longer invited to ritzy high-profile international conferences, no longer treated with deference by the mass media, and no longer able to make a second living by smuggling and protection racketeering. The power of this parasitic class was what protracted the fighting in Northern Ireland for years and years after it had become obvious to all that nobody except the racketeers could win. And when it was over, far too many of the racketeers became profiteers of the peace process as well. Know what got people going in Belfast in the early 1970s was not humanism and solidarity, but rather violence, cruelty, conspiracy, bigotry, alcohol, and organized crime. I did in fact make friends with a few Protestant workers in the Woodvale district who showed some interest in crossing the divide and having speech with their Catholic brethren, but they developed a pressing tendency to wind up in the trunks of bullet-sprayed cars, or sometimes, I think of Ernie Elliott, to be bullet-sprayed before being stuffed into the trunk. This was all brought home to me with a singular force when James failed to turn up for a rendezvous that we had made in Ardenstown, a grit-strewn housing estate dominated by the emerging provisional IRA. He had gone to the agreed pub and sat down to look at some documents about British Army roundups and internments in the area. This was a mistake, arguably a big one. Within minutes, a group had joined him and told him to put his hands on the table, under which a gun was pointing at his midsection. Taken to a filthy house and told to lie on the floor, he was kept for several hours while his captors failed to reach the various people in London who could have vouched that he was indeed a reporter and not a spy or provocateur. But eventually they let him go, and he wrote quite an amusing account of his brush with terror. This was rendered much less risible a few days later, when in a villainous Belfast tavern I chanced to introduce him to a local reporter with known Republican connections. "Did you say Fenton?" breathed this worthy gent. Did you know they took a vote about what to do with you? It was just 6-5 against shooting you there and then. That sort of vote was almost the only concept of democracy that some of the denizens of the city were ever able to form. The woman who had chaired the meeting, a haggard crone by the name of Mayor Drum, was later shot in her hospital bed by some no less tender Ulster volunteer, unionist riffraff, who were prepared to cross the city's divide just for a chance to enjoy such an atrocity. A reprehensible temptation presented itself at once. In places like this, in contrast to the very dreary precincts of the British urban and suburban and rural mainland, there was drama to be had, and for the asking. Every night and day there were bombs and gunshots and riots and roundups, and it didn't take long to gain little access to the bars and shebeens where these things were discussed with certain knowingness. One could do this as a political activist, or as a journalist, or as in my case, an amateur combination of both. I have to admit that sometimes I found this double life more than just figuratively intoxicating. I was sufficiently furious after the British Army massacre of demonstrators on Bloody Sunday that I once shocked Fenton very much by saying that if an IRA man were to be on the run, and needing no more than a bed for the night, and not a word spoken, I myself might be ready to furnish the needful. Of course, I knew to beware of this vicarious identification with the authentic. I had acquired some of that wariness in Cuba, but I hadn't yet quite learned to stay clear of it consistently. And to mention another expression that annoyed James so much that I often used it merely to tease him, these encounters on the dark side also supplied good copy. In the weirdly beautiful landscapes along the Irish border, most especially in Derry with its haunting evening light along the waterside and the old walls, and in rainy Belfast with its 19th century slums and yet its permanent view of the lovely surrounding hills, I saw my first war without even needing a passport to travel to it.